Okay, here we go with the FAR bar as is 5. We're going to cover section 12 in this session. Section 12, important on the as is contract. This is the property inspection and the right to cancel. A couple things in here we want to pay particular attention to. And so we're just going to read it once again. Let me reiterate, this contract has everything written for a reason. You need to understand why the lines are there and what they mean to you if you're representing the buyer and or the seller, whoever that may be. All right, so in this case, let's take a look at the section A of section 12, which is property inspections and right to cancel. Buyer shall have, and it says if left blank, then 15 days. I put 10 in this contract. Let me just tell you, it depends on who you're representing, but note here, I even make a note up here, this is a get out of jail free card for the buyer. During this as is contract, let me just make a quick point of opinion here. Listing agents are right now encouraging and mandating and telling their sellers that we need to use the as is contract. That is fine because it's not obligating the seller to any repairs. However, understand that this is a complete and utter get out of jail free card for the buyer. This means, all right, if we read it, the buyer shall have 10, in my case, if left blank, then 15 days after the effective date, the inspection period, within which to have such inspections of the property performed as buyer shall desire during the inspection period. If the buyer determines in the buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election to the seller prior to the expiration of the inspection period. If the buyer timely terminates this contract, the deposit shall be returned to the buyer. It's very clear. Also note here, we've had this discussion with the FAR legal hotline. There is no requirement. There is no requirement that the inspection be actually done, right? It doesn't say here that it has to be inspected by a professional inspector and so on and so forth. It says clearly if the buyer determines in the buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer, then the buyer may terminate this contract as long as it's done within the inspection period. Now, if you are representing the buyer and the buyer says, well, I'd like to make an offer on this property, and then 4 days into this, another house comes on the market that they like better, and they want to say, let's give that other one a shot and see if we can get them to negotiate on this. And they make an offer, and they're going back and forth for another 3 or 4 days, and they finally get that one to go to contract, and they end up liking this better, then they can do that, even though you'd say, well, how can they do that? Because they're under a contract with 2 properties. Well, this contract, the initial one, has a get out of jail free card. They just notify, as long as it's done within the inspection period, let me reiterate that the buyer is not satisfied in the buyer's sole discretion. It doesn't have to really have a reason. They're just saying, hey, look, I don't like what I'm finding in my inspections. Well, what do those inspections mean, or what did they look like, or what did they find? It really doesn't matter. It means that the buyer's not satisfied in their sole discretion and the buyer wants out. And there really is no question about that. All right. So just realize that. So before you, as a listing agent representing the seller, negotiate an as-is contract and think that you've done such a great job for your client, realize that that is the case. Now, my suggestion to you, if you do have a listing and you represent the seller and they want an as-is contract, I would shorten this time period to as little as possible. Because what has to happen is the buyer has to not only have their inspections, but elect to cancel during that time period. Because if we read further on this other stuff, read through it, it basically says that the buyer shall still be responsible to repair any damage as a result of the inspections. But unless the buyer exercises the right to terminate the granted herein, meaning if they terminate within this time period, buyer accepts the physical condition of the property and any violation of the governmental building, environmental, and safety codes, restrictions, requirements, but subject to seller's continuing as-is maintenance requirements. What does that mean? It means that if the buyer goes all the way past this date, then they're deemed to have accepted the property in its as-is condition. The only thing the seller would have to do is abide by Section 11, which we covered earlier, which is maintaining the property in its current condition except for normal wear and tear. And then the buyer shall be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by the buyer's lender. So let's say down the road, we get past our inspection period, the buyer's okay with it and still continues on with the property, and then all of a sudden the lender comes back and in the appraisal says, I need A, B, and C fixed. this line right here on line 261, and buyer shall be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by buyer's lender, that burden falls now on the buyer. All right, it's no longer a seller mandated issue. The exception to that would be if we had an FHA deal and there were extra repairs in the FHA addendum, which we'll cover later on the FHA rider. But a lot of times we're not using FHA if we're going as is. So just bear that in mind. Okay, now we move on to section B. By the way, all this has to be done within the inspection period. If we miss the inspection period as a buyer's agent and we get past that, then the buyer no longer has the right to cancel based upon inspections, period. There's no question about it. It is what it is. All right? So part B, walkthrough, inspection, reinspection. On the day prior to closing date or on closing date prior to the time of closing as specified by the buyer. So it's really the buyer's choice, all right, but it has to be agreed upon by all parties. Buyer or the buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough and follow-up walkthrough if necessary inspection of the property. Here's the reason for the walkthrough, all right, solely to confirm that all the items of personal property are on the property. Meaning if they said they were going to leave the refrigerator and they were going to leave the washer and dryer and they were going to leave the second refrigerator in the garage, and if they were going to leave the range and everything else, then the seller has done that. By the way, it's not a bad idea to protect yourself as you're writing these items into the contract. We talked about that way back when we were listing the personal property that stays with the property, that you snap a quick photo. I have seen in my day very nice refrigerators, side-by-side refrigerator, stainless steel in the property when we make the offer and we negotiate the deal, and then we go to do the walkthrough, and there's their great Aunt Gertrude's old 1958 refrigerator replaced in there. All right. So if you have no evidence that that's there, you get snapping some photos of these items would not be a bad idea. So you can have visual proof that that's what was there when you made the offer. All right. But that's the only reason for the walkthrough, is to confirm that the stuff is still there and that the as-is requirement, meaning that there is nothing outside of normal wear and tear, that has significantly changed. All of a sudden, when you did the inspection, everything was fine. The roof was watertight, appeared to be, and now, 3.5 weeks later, you go to do a final walkthrough, and you see huge water stains in the ceiling. Well, that's not like it was when you did the inspection, so that is something that the buyer could request and say, hey, look, you didn't maintain the property the way it was back when I did my inspection back, 25, 30 days ago, whatever it was. All right. So that's a requirement there. And then C. All right. This is kind of a new one that's been added based upon permits. But realize what's here in section C. It's that the seller has to assist and cooperate, but the seller does not have to repair or do anything to fix or remedy because it's an as-is contract. Seller assistance, cooperation, and closeout of building permits. If the buyer's inspection of the property identifies are open or needed building permits, the seller shall promptly deliver buyer all plans, written documentation, and other information in the seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to the improvements of the property which are subject to such open permits, and shall properly cooperate in good faith with the buyers. So what it's saying is, let's say you do a permit search and you find that there's a couple open permits. Well, if the seller has anything in their possession, they need to assist you and provide that to you so you, the buyer, can get those things closed out. Now, quick word of advice. If you want to back out of this contract based upon open permits as a buyer, the only time you have to do that is way back up here. Let's go back up to the top during the inspection period. So you need to get on that right away, because if we're talking 10 or 15 days, then that needs to happen sooner than later. So you need to get on it right away. All right. But this just says if you discover some things and the buyer says, okay, I still want to proceed. All right. But I need some help getting this stuff closed out or remedied or whatever the case may be, then the seller needs to cooperate if they have any items to assist. Seller's obligation to cooperate shall include execution of necessary authorization. So like if we need something signed by them because they're the current owner of the property, right, then they agree to do that, or other documents necessary for buyer to conduct inspections and have estimates for such repairs or work prepared. But in fulfilling such obligation, here it is, seller shall not be required to expend or become obligated to expend any money. All right. So up here I make a note. Seller needs to assist in closing out open or needed permits. But down here, however, seller is not required in an as-is contract to expend any money to cure that. All right. So just realize that that's there. And then finally, Section D under Section 12 says that the assignment of repair and treatment contracts and warranties at buyer's option and cost, seller will, at closing, assign all assignable repair, treatment, and maintenance contracts and warranties to the buyer. What this means is this, is that if the buyer doesn't want it, then it doesn't have to happen. But if the buyer would like it, right, then let's say there was a termite treatment done 2 years ago, and the seller has continued on with an annual policy to cover that, which means it would get retreated for free because the seller has paid for that. All right. And if there is a $50 transfer fee at closing that the new buyer can continue on with that warranty, then it says at the buyer's option, if they elect to, the seller will assign that. All right. But it says at buyer's option and cost. So the $50 would be the responsibility of the buyer, and the seller has agreed and not withhold that ability to do that, whether it be other maintenance contracts. Maybe there's a maintenance contract on the AC, or maybe there's a maintenance contract on the pool, or whatever the case may be, that the seller agrees to transfer those but is not obligated to expend any money to do so. And the buyer doesn't have to expend money to get it if they can just say, forget it, I'm just going to let it go, and I don't care about the warranty or the extended maintenance contract. Fair enough? So that in its entirety is the as-is section of this contract. It talks about repair or inspections. Realize it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, and govern yourselves accordingly. That is Section 12. Thanks.